And welcome everybody to the Agronomists. It's great to be here. I'm your host, Sean Haney. I'm really looking forward to tonight's show. Two of my favorite agronomists that I get to talk to actually quite frequently on a bunch of RealAg Lives, as well as they both appear regularly on RealAg Radio on our Rural Radio 147 show on Sirius XM. Listen, if you have a question or a comment tonight for our panel, I encourage you to participate. This show is live. So bring your questions. Let's learn together, whether you're watching on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter, or Twitch, actually. If you're over there, that's fine too. But bring your questions. We're going to have a really, really great chat for really cereal growers across the country. Both of our agronomists tonight are super informed on kind of they have their region of expertise, but both have actually spent a lot of time in different parts of the country. So we're going to have a lot of fun and learn together. Let's bring in tonight's panel. Here we go. Tonight we have Peter Pete Johnson. Hey Pete, how are you?
I'm awesome, thanks, Sean. Always have fun to be here, and just going to be a whole bunch of fun tonight. Lots of things to talk about. Just excellent.
Yeah, I asked both of you for sort of some notes. So what are some of the things you guys want to talk about? And I did mention it was a 60-minute show. You guys sent enough for, I think, like about 3 hours. This may be a 2 or 3-parter. Also joining us tonight is Jeremy Boychyn. He is a head agronomist with Alberta Wheat and Barley Commission. Hey, Jeremy, how are you?
I'm doing good. I wouldn't miss this for the world. When you sent me the invite, I was super excited to be on a panel with you two. So yeah, excited to be here.
Well, you're going to learn, you might learn some stuff from me. Pete, I don't know. I can't speak for that. But
all the videos I've seen in the past, it looks like Sean's teaching Pete and Pete's giving the instructions back.
Well,
oh yeah, I'm used to it.
Today on RealAg Live, we talked all about Canada-China relations with Charles Burton. It was pretty heavy topic. It was a lot of fun. I expect tonight to be a little bit lighter in sort of the mood. But hey, let's kind of talk here, guys, about the overarching pieces of tonight's talk. And we're going to show some clips. I've actually got a clip that was one of the original videos we ever filmed with Real Agriculture. I'm excited to kind of show that and just kind of go back in the vault. But, Pete, when you think about cereal variety selection, at 100,000 feet, what kind of comes to mind are the key things that people need to be paying attention to?
So from the 100,000 feet level, man, I mean, at the end of the day, it's all about yield, right? And you just can't forget about yield. It's always the driver. But then there's so many other things that come into play. The lodging. We want to talk a bunch about where your data comes from, because the way that the data is generated has a huge impact on how it might relate to your own farm. So I think you really have to step back and look at everything. Diseases. I mean, gosh, if we get really fancy, we're going to start looking at root structure. And, out west, that's a big deal in terms of how it can access moisture from down deep. They do a bunch of that in the UK. We really haven't done as much of that here. But just a whole range of things that all add up to making sure that I get that yield potential that is in that particular variety. So very cool stuff.
Yeah, Jeremy, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, what Pete said. But, I think of when you're a producer, you have a specific environment that you're growing in. And that environment you can't change unless you decide to pick up and move to Saskatchewan or to Ontario, wherever it happens to be. But that next step is variety selection. And when you're selecting that variety, it's almost like the pivot point that a lot of the other management decisions then weigh upon. A variety can vary your nitrogen rate. It can vary what you're putting in crop, whether you're utilizing PGRs or in Western Canada, maybe an in-crop nitrogen. It can vary your nitrogen rates. So to me, it is the foundation on which we need to start thinking about, or continue to think about, how we trial and look at and implement different management practices. So it is really, to me, it's the glue that we're all looking to stick to when it comes to management practices, to, like Pete said, to get the best yield potential in the environment you're in with the genetics that you have.
Number one
Go
choice,
ahead.
number one management choice that you make. And if you look at the trials, man, you can, in some like corn, you can have a 60 bushel spread from the bottom variety or hybrid to the top hybrid. We don't have quite that big a spread in cereals, but even still, you can have 20 or 30 bushel difference based on that variety that you choose. And I mean, there's other factors like quality that play, but it is the number one choice. So you just have to spend time focusing in and getting that right.
It sets the stage, right? It's one of those things that you control. I think that's the way maybe I would describe it. If everybody wants to take any agronomic tips from me, like there's a lot, there's a
Just throw that out there.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's start right there with
if you are here to qualify for CCA credits, you may get them docked by listening. But I actually should mention that too, that if you are a CCA, you can qualify for CCA credits. Just go to realagriculture.com/agronomists and you can get that done by pushing the button. Okay, but yes, it sets the stage because there's lots of things that can happen during the growing year, completely, totally, utterly out of our control. Fertility plan and variety selection are really kind of the key things that set the base for giving you the opportunity to succeed through the growing season. So there you go. There's my 2 bits. Hey, let's do this. I've been like, since Friday, since I found this clip, I've been just wanting to show it. And it's really short, but this goes back to it's not the first, because I remember which one is the first, but it is in the first 5 videos I ever shot with Real Agriculture. So just imagine this is January 2009. We're going back, crop production show in Saskatoon. Here's this idiot kid walking around with a video camera, videoing people at a farm show. Nobody's doing it, and I was just basically trying to find people that I knew to try to convince them they should do it. And one of those people was Jim Downey with Secan, and I asked him, what are some of the things you need to consider when choosing a cereal variety? So let's cue up this first clip and have a look at me and Jim talking about it. This is going back in time. This is in the Real Ag Vault. Here we go. Okay, Jim, so we're going to talk about some of the things a farmer should think about when choosing a variety.
Well, when I talk to farmers, specifically at trade shows, first question I ask them is where do they farm? So that tells me what soil zone they're in, what's their moisture like, what are their yield potentials like, what kind of straw strength they might need in a variety, and what crops are suited or well adapted or commonly grown in the area. So farmer, first of all, has to think about where does he farm, what kind of weather is he going to be facing. And that starts to tell you what you should be looking for in a variety. Quite often the first thing that farmers want to look at is how does it yield. Of course, that's a no-brainer. That's kind of what we want to look at is relative yields compared to the check. But then you should go on from there. You're trying to pick one of the top 3 for yield, and then start to look at what's going to perform well in my area over the long term for yield, and then what's going to protect the grade, what's going to give me the straw strength, what's going to be in demand by the market down the road. So these are all kind of things that farmers should look at, sort of the agronomic traits, the market demand. And then I always ask them, where can we get that variety? How far do you have to drive to find that variety? So this is where we talked about who's your local CCAN member, because they're going to be the closest to your farm in most cases to pick up that or source that variety. And this becomes an issue because the freight on the seed tends to add a lot to the cost of the seed potentially, unless you have a neighbor who's a seed grower. So I try to go through those kind of things with the farmers so that they can get a variety that works for their farm and not have to drive across the prairies to find it.
The first thing you'll notice is the epic video quality that is in that video going back to 2009. But I think, some of the things that Jim says it still holds true today, Jeremy, doesn't it?
Yeah, I'm going to have to say I agree with most of what he says. And I think what he says also depends on the region that you're in. Yes, yield has it, and it should be top on the list. But, I talk to producers who are in high lodging pressure areas of Alberta, where as much as yield plays a huge role, lodging is right up there as well. So yes, I could pick my top 3 yielding varieties, but if they all lodge over, then throw them out the window, because they're of no use to me if I'm in a high yielding, high moisture, high lodging potential area. So I agree, but I also think that we're at a point where we have such strong genetics coming out in Western Canada. I can't speak too much of what's going on in Ontario, but I know in Western Canada, we have such great potential with genetics that, we kind of anticipate that yield is going to be there. And the downfall of whether it be disease resistance or lodging is typically going to make up that difference that you see in yield. So there's no point headed for the top yielding variety if you're just going to have to scrape it off the ground and your quality is going to be poor. So I agree, but I might take a little bit of a different approach to it.
Yeah, good point. Ray's asking, why didn't we get to see Sean and what he looked like in 2009? Because, Ray, there are some horrific pairs of glasses that I have worn through the history, and even worse haircuts. They're out there. You can find them. I don't want to encourage the sharing of them. That's why you did not see me in those videos. Pete, I know one of the points that you brought up was, okay, so because we're going to talk about the characteristics here in a second of what you should be, how you evaluate, but it's what information should I take into consideration? And you gave an example in the UK how they actually take it another step even further than we are currently doing in either Eastern or Western Canada.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, Sean, you've come a long way since that video, because it was an absolute opportunity for Jim to make sure he got the plug in there for CCAN and free advertising, and you just smiled and let it go. And
you go, Jim. I was just happy that Jim agreed to do the interview. Let's just base it right there. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you have a mustache like Jim at that point, Sean? Because that's pretty stellar mustache.
That
man.
was a good mustache. That was Tom Selleck right there.
Hey, so no, it really is interesting. And as you ramp up the management, it makes a huge impact in what you look for in that variety information that you're assessing. So in the UK, they actually do trials where they plant early. So it's winter wheat. It's not spring wheat there, but they're planting variety trials early, and they're also planting them late. And they do, surprisingly, they have quite a few spring cereal trials. They'll do the same thing with spring cereals, because the reaction of a variety planted early versus planted late is sometimes quite different. They can totally flip their performance. Plus, they also will do trials where they're under full management. It's basically just give it the full program and see how that variety can yield, where they control as many of the diseases as they can with fungicides and lots of nitrogen and all of those management inputs. And they'll also do the same variety trial with very low management, so that if I'm not going to rely on fungicides, can the genetics of that variety control the disease or tolerate the disease is a better word than control, and still end up with good yield potential. And so those things, we don't do those here in North America. In Ontario, we do now do trials where we use a fungicide. So we call them managed. They're not totally managed. We don't use a growth regulator. We're not using more nitrogen, and we don't look at planting dates, which I really think is a key component. But yeah, even simple things like row width have a huge impact on how varieties might perform, and you got to delve into a little bit more detail when it comes to looking at those performance trials.
Yeah, because you mentioned that Western trials are on 10 to 12 inch rows, select for varieties that are bushy and will canopy in wide rows. If a grower moves to 7.5 inch rows, it could make a difference.
Yeah. So
go ahead.
The classic example is in Ohio, and they actually will grow 15-inch row wheat. And everybody else is growing 7.5-inch row wheat, and they grow 15-inch row wheat because for a while there, they would go in and plant soybeans into the standing wheat crop. And so they wanted the 15-inch row wheat so they had somewhere to plant the soybeans. There's not many guys left doing that. But what they found was a tremendous difference in 7.5-inch rows. I tend to select for varieties that have better standability because you're getting the plants closer together, but also for very upright leaf architecture. And if you take that upright leaf architecture and you put it in 15-inch rows, it'll never canopy. And then all that sunlight hits the ground and the plant doesn't intercept it. And that variety that might be number one in 15-inch rows, in 7.5-inch rows rather, becomes a dog in 15s because it just can't intercept that sunlight. So knowing those kind of differences is really, really critical.
Now, so Jeremy, why aren't we doing more of that kind of stuff? I guess maybe the simple answer to that is dollars, but is the interest out there? Because it seems to me like, having more of those kinds of comparisons it's more information. It's better for agronomists. It's better for growers.
I mean, I agree with you and with Pete's excitement. It would be nice in a perfect world. We could have all comparisons and all different types of treatment. And then a producer would say, well, that's the same treatment that I do, so I'll take that and plop that down there. But that was the response when I got when I asked that question. Why aren't we doing these kind of things? And it's, where can we find the money at this point? And it doesn't mean it won't happen in the future, because as interest grows, that's where the money is going to end up flowing. But I think there is a ton of value to doing some of those management differences in some of those RVTs. And Pete mentioned it, seeding date, and recent research that I'm sure you're aware of, Brian Barrett's looking at different seeding rates or seeding dates. Does that apply to every variety? Does that apply to every region in Ontario, in Saskatchewan, in the Peace versus Southern Alberta? And these are the questions that we don't know the answer yet. I'm even envious of Ontario doing a fungicide and a non-fungicide. If I could get that, I think that'd be quite nice, because that's a huge thing we see, and it's a huge decision factor, is disease resistance. So knowing how a variety is going to respond or even yield when it's treated with a fungicide versus not, is a huge amount of value to a producer, because if they don't need to spray a fungicide, because the results of that trial show it's non-beneficial, and they do have an extended rotation and they're not seeing issues, it just helps make better management decisions. It stops from unnecessary spraying, saves money, and potentially gets us to the yield where we want to be. It would be nice to see, but I think, and I'm sure we will get there, I think this is where on-farm trials at this point provide a lot of value. We can look at these numbers that come from regional variety trials, and I think I saw someone comment there about, the Peace regional variety trials. They're across a large area, and you're looking at a compilation of all these numbers. It's a median, it's a mean. So being able to, if you want to look at regional data, you're then selecting from a much smaller data set. And when you're selecting for a much smaller data set, then your numbers are not going to be as strong, and you're not as confident with the results you're getting from it. So either we look at a big scale and be confident in the numbers, or we try and look at a small scale and the numbers are not as confident. But even still, in both those situations, taking that variety and seeing how it's going to respond on your own farm is where you're going to get the most value.
Because if some of these trials aren't going to put a fungicide on, or aren't going to put the groceries, so to speak, from a fertility standpoint to some of these varieties to really test them, what is the data actually telling you? It's giving you kind of a guideline. But if you're somebody that is doing something that is, from a management standpoint, that is drastically different than what's in those trials, I think Jeremy's hit on a very, very good point here. On-farm trialing is really a key piece of the equation here, because you're testing varieties and their performance and how they respond under your circumstances and your management. That is, if you do it right, which is, I think, a key piece of this. It's extremely valuable here in this comparison between some of the public trials and what you're doing on your own farm, right?
Oh yeah, 100%. So you know, Sean, and Jeremy knows as well. Like I'm a plot guy, and dang it all, you have to do your own trials. But be careful, because when you do your own trials, that's one environment. So if it happens to be a dry year in your area, and all of a sudden this one variety looks really outstanding, but you only have that one environment. You might have it spread over several different locations, but you're still, if it turns wet, do you see that same response? And so you have to go a little bit slowly, and you have to look at bigger data to say, okay, if I get that variety in 12 different environments, spread out over a bigger region, whether that's southern Alberta, southern Saskatchewan, or it's, I don't know, all across the Peace District, but you compile all that data and say, okay, on average, this looks like it does really well. Or maybe you find out it does really well when it's dry because it's got good drought tolerance, but it's got crappy disease tolerance. And then on the wet year, you just get hammered with I don't know, spot blotch or some disease that just totally changes that. So on-farm trials are so easy now with RTK. One of the things I really be careful, so often people say, okay, so I'll take that quarter section and I'll put that in that new variety. And that quarter section will yield, I don't know, 8 bushels better than everything else. And Lord help us, so that variety is 8 bushels better. You don't know if it's 8 bushels better because you have a quarter section. You have to do it in strips in the field. And with RTK, that's so easy that you can do 4, 5, 8, 11 reps, 12, whatever. And then you have some really good data and put it on 3/4 sections. So now all of a sudden you've got it in different areas that you're farming, and it becomes really powerful data. But if you do 1/4 section, or if you do one side by side where half the quarter section is in this variety and half the quarter section in that variety, it's one replication. Man, you can have a 10% yield difference, and it pretty much is a flip of the coin. You're not sure if that's real or it's not.
Yeah,
my favorite Pete is I'll split the field in half and see how she does.
Yep, absolutely. Hoo-ha.
Yeah. George says checks and replications on plots can give you accurate data. And I think for some of the agronomists that are watching, maybe you work at an ag retail, ag retails, there's a lot of them that really try to do some of this trialing and showcasing, not just of some of the varieties, but some of the obviously other products that they're selling as well. It's very valuable information. And I think with some of the technology that's out there now, it's just become a lot easier. Like the weigh wagon, still important, but we can do some of this stuff without the weigh wagon now, which is, I think, awesome.
Yeah, scales on your buggy, and man, you like there's way. It's easy to do now. Be careful with the yield monitor, because yield monitors are still impact sensors, and so when you deal with something like wheat, the waxiness of the kernel can actually sometimes, if it's not calibrated to that variety, you pull into a different variety, it actually has a different impact on that center or on that sensor rather, because it's too waxy. So you got to verify if you're just going to use the yield monitor. Be really careful with that. But absolutely, there's lots of ways to get that data, and it's incredibly critical.
Calibration's critical, because I'll give you an example in my personal life is that I have a spin bike, and I bought this heart rate monitor, and it kept on showing me in 90% of my heart rate, and I was like, man, I'm just giving her, what a workout, this is great. And then it turns out it was set for somebody that was in their 70s, so it's like, yeah, I might need to calibrate. That might be good. Jim Hale has a question. Jim farms in Saskatchewan. He's watching on Facebook. How about producers rolling with multi varieties on the same wheat type? I don't know if he means in the same field at the same time, but let's look at it this way. How many varieties should I be growing on my farm, Jeremy, of a given class?
Oh, that is a great question. I mean, I've seen producers in the range of 3. Typically, that's max where I see. And I think It depends on your risk tolerance and the logistics of your farm. Like that's really where that's going to come in. Typically when you're looking for a different wheat variety, you're looking for a different characteristic that's going to mitigate some risk on your farm that may show up. So you pick one that's maybe little bit lower yielding, but it has a greater disease package, and then you pick one that's a little bit higher yielding, but maybe the disease package isn't as strong. So I really think there is no defined answer for that. I think it really comes down to risk mitigation and what the logistics on your farm are looking like. If you're a smaller farm, then it becomes a little bit more challenging, maybe to have multiple varieties. But if you have more acres and more bins, potentially you could use multiple varieties. If it's in the same field, I've heard of producers mixing 4 different varieties in the same field and getting positive and getting good. Oh no, we've upset Pete.
Well, whatever. He gets upset all the time.
From that. Now I'm curious what Pete has to say about this.
No, Jim is kind of trying to clarify here. So Lauren says, is Jim talking about varietal blends in the same field? And Jim says 3 intermix, some folks playing around with this.
Yeah, and so we've looked at that, and it can work. The big reason that I go, no, don't do it is man, I guess if you don't have fusarium at all, maybe you can take the risk, but the chances of getting 3 varieties to all be at the right stage for a fungicide application at the right time, man, I have enough trouble trying to get one variety to head out uniformly enough to do a decent job. And now we're going to throw 3 varieties together. There is a little bit of work out there where people have played with that. The research that we've done, like we have tried that, and the theory so there's a little bit of thought process that people have used with this, and you want one variety that is a tall variety, and 10% of the blend is the tall variety, so that it can intercept more sunlight and really give it for yield, and then 90% of the balance is a shorter variety, and that's the thought process. Is it kind of sets the bar, but you get this yield boost out of this taller variety. I don't know. We tried that. We couldn't make it work. If you can do it and give it a go, just because I don't think it works doesn't mean you shouldn't try it. Try it, prove me wrong, and tell me, and we'll learn from you. But it's been a challenge.
Well, but I think this is happening a lot. It's called common seed, isn't it, Jeremy?
I wouldn't put those in the same category, Sean.
Okay,
I think.
Thank you.
I mean,
I've
seen a few producers trying this, and then there's actually seed growers in Alberta that have been doing plots on this and having really positive response. So it's of interest, and even on the barley side, we've done trials of intervarietal mixing, and it didn't provide a huge yield benefit, but it did provide a disease mitigation benefit. So, if we could find a way to utilize this to maybe find ways of not having to use fungicide when it's not as necessary, or just getting the increased yield that can potentially come from it if it does work out. But I know it's something of interest, and I know there's a lot more producers that have asked me about it. And I think some research actually needs to be done before we can make a call. And I agree with you, Pete. You are creating a high risk scenario when you're doing multiple different varieties and you have a much longer flowering window. I mean, one of the biggest things we talk about in terms of FHB risk mitigation is making sure that your seeding is bang on. Because when you get that seed in the ground and it emerges evenly and you have everything nice and even maturing, that flowering window is ideal to mitigate risk. But some of the new research that's coming out with Randy Kutcher and some of the stuff that Kelly Turkington has been looking at is that risk of dawn and that risk of FHB accumulation extends past that FHB window, or past that flowering window. Mind you, it is the biggest risk window, but thinking of it of a bigger scale, if we could if we could use varieties that have good FHB resistance, good timing, then potentially we can get there. Whether we have that available to us right now is a bigger question. But I think it's worth investigating.
Well, I know this. Gone are the days where, Pete and I were talking about this topic a couple weeks ago on RealAg Radio, and I always think of AC Berry, right? AC Berry covered massive amounts of acres across Western Canada. It might be one of the last spring wheat varieties where it just gets planted everywhere. We've really regionalized, specialized things a lot more. A little bit, it's kind of moving, I guess I would compare it to more like a corn model where you have a lot more regionality to some of the varieties. And so you need to take your data down that road as well. Jenneth has a question here. What is the best strategy to introducing or testing a new variety to one's farm? What percentage of acres should you trial it on? Jeremy, you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, and I don't think there's a designated answer for this. I think it depends on your capacity logistically to do this, and it also depends on your risk tolerance on trying some of these things. Something like 5% of your acres, 10% of your acres is probably 10% would probably be a lot in a first year. And it's interesting because I asked this question to a corn and soybean grower in Ontario, because I always find it interesting that it seems like corn growers in Ontario, they have 5 or 6 different varieties at least that they're trialing their first year. And then in the next year, they're taking those top 2 from that first year and then seeding them to planting them to maybe 10 or 15% of their acres. And then if those 2 or 3 or one from those 2 or 3 in that second year do really well, then it expands to maybe 80% of their acres. I'm not saying this is every corn grower, but I think starting reasonably small is smart. Pick a field or 2 fields that you think are contrasting, but make up a decent percentage of or a decent volume of your acres, and then do some strip trials on those fields. If you only have 2 fields of wheat, then pick half of one and do strip trials on that half of one and see how it compares, or do some on one and some on the other. I don't think there's a defined answer. I think when you're thinking about it and how it would fit on your farm, you'll be able to kind of see at what point you're just putting too much risk and too much logistics and too much time into executing. Yeah. In Western Canada, our season's short enough and quick enough as it is. So we don't want to be throwing everything out just to try and do an excess amount of wheat variety trials.
So, some people are pretty aggressive. Oh, variety looks good. That's planted on the whole farm. It does happen.
Yeah. And sometimes if you do that and the variety happens to fall apart, and we actually had that happen here in Ontario this year with an oat variety. I think the other thing that you have to look at is how much data is out there to support this particular variety. Do you have 4 years of research trials that make it look really good? Is it like corn, where we're actually looking at only 1 year of variety trials, or 2 at the most, where you're trying to make that decision? If it's gone across a broad geography and been in research trials for 4 years and been consistent, then I think you go a little more aggressive. But you always have to be cautious, because it can be different on your farm. And once in a while, you get a variety like we did with our oat variety this year that looks awesome and was 30% lower yielding than anything else that growers grew. And some growers put way too many acres into that particular variety for that to happen this year.
Okay, let's watch our second clip. This is Mike Cobra. He is the wheat specialist with Omafra. And kind of hinting at, when you're choosing a variety, make sure you take into consideration things that are going to happen later on in the growing season. In this example, it has to do with herbicide application. Let's watch the next clip. Here we go. This is Mike Cobra from Omafra.
So we're sitting here at the Spring Performance Variety Trials at the Alora Research Station, University of Guelph. They're conducted by Dr. Ali Navabi and managed by Nicholas Welker, his technician. Now, normally when we think about performance trials, it's about comparing yields, it's about comparing standability, maybe disease tolerance. Rarely do we think about differences in herbicide injury, but this year at this site we had the opportunity to look at that. To control weeds, a grass and broadleaf herbicide was applied to every single plot here, and what the researchers noticed once the barley was going out into head is that there was pretty significant differences in the level of crop injury amongst different varieties. Now, maybe as a breeder, you're not so keen about those results. From a weed scientist, from a farmer's perspective, I want to know that information, because if I'm growing a spring barley variety, I'm going to be trying to control weeds, I'm going to be using herbicides. I want to know if that variety is going to be more sensitive to the herbicide or not. So let's take a step back for a second. What causes herbicide injury in cereals? And it's usually three components. One is environmental stress. If it's cool, cloudy, wet, that spring cereal, in this case barley, has a tougher time metabolizing the herbicide, more prone to injury. That's number one. Number two is the staging. If we make herbicide applications closer to flag leaf and heading, that puts more stress on the plant during the reproductive phase. That's no good either. And then lastly, there's varietal sensitivity. And rarely do we have an opportunity to actually see differences between varieties and at least document them. And we have that situation here. So let's look at one, what type of injury we're seeing, and then two, the difference between a susceptible and more tolerant variety. So if we look here at this plot, we have a spring barley variety, that's really showing this leaf distortion on the head. The awns are incredibly distorted, and it's causing the actual head to curl up. And so we would assume that will have some negative impact on yield, because the cereal head hasn't been able to form properly. Now, in this case, about 30% of the plants have this distorted head. Let's contrast that to the plot behind. Different variety, and you can see here, awns are normal. They have that normal straight up appearance. There's no distortion whatsoever in this particular variety. So the only difference here, same herbicide, same application date, same environmental conditions, just a difference in varietal susceptibility. So what do we learn from a trial like this? Well, when it comes to herbicide injury, there's certainly ways we can avoid it and minimize it. But if we look at the impact here of differences in variety, I don't think it's too hard to imagine a circumstance where maybe we've lost 10, 15, even 20% yield loss from these distorted heads. Time will tell. So if we want to minimize the risk of that type of injury, that type of economic loss, there's three things we can focus on. Number one, we can avoid applying herbicides under extreme environmental conditions. And by that I mean avoid temperatures that are really cold, so below 5 degrees Celsius, or when air temperatures are really hot, above 25 degrees Celsius, or even the fluctuation of cold to hot and vice versa. The second thing we can do is avoid making applications close to the reproductive phase of a cereal crop like barley. So specifically, once the flag leaves out, we want to be out of that game. We want to be applying well before the flag leaf to minimize herbicide injury. And then lastly, we want to take advantage of varietal differences. So in a trial like this, we see varietal differences. It's important to see and know those varietal differences. You can look at the performance trials, you can talk to your seed supplier and your trusted local agronomist.
That's who a lot of our audience is here, that trusted local agronomist. So I'll admit, I've not thought about variety selection, how that applies to herbicide injury. And I didn't actually, when I watched the clip again on Friday, I didn't know it was a thing, Pete.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And the one thing Mike didn't mention is in that scenario, if they had have split out the broadleaf herbicide from the grass herbicide, we probably wouldn't have seen that level of injury. But because they were applied together, the more you put in the tank, the more stress you're putting on the plant. And we hadn't seen that before because we typically don't have to use a graminicide in our performance trials. They had some foxtail come through, like very heavy foxtail, and they applied too late. They put both products together. gosh, from a weed control standpoint, if once you're done tillering, basically you've already lost yield. You really should be trying to control those weeds much earlier than what Mike was talking about. But there are real varietal interactions, and so not only with herbicides. The other thing that people should think about, because growth regulators are becoming a bigger part of our high management operations all the time. And by the way, Modus, another growth regulator, Modus got registered last week. So we've been waiting. It's been in the system for like 5 years and never, finally, it did get registered. So it'll be here for next year. We have manipulator, we have Modus, we have Ethereal, all of those things. But we've seen tremendous interaction between variety and growth regulators as well. So you have to go slowly with some of those things and figure that out. And just it's not easy to come up with that data. Mike talked about your agronomist, your seed company. They're probably the best place because there's no performance trial where we go out there and try to look at herbicide interaction, or for that matter, right now, growth regulator interaction.
Yeah, Jeremy, I think this growth regulator one and how they impact the performance of the variety, or how they perform on a variety, that's something we're going to see a lot more going forward as we see more products registered and then becoming a little bit more mainstream across parts of Western Canada.
I have to say, first off, Sean, when I saw that video, that was certainly the first time I have seen that video, and I was unaware of the significant impact that some of these herbicides can have on barley. And I started poking around and I asked the question to a couple breeders, and Western Canada doesn't have any actual research on this, none that I found, or no one that I've chatted with. So it was very interesting to see that. But one of the breeders that I chatted with said, while they're doing their breeding trials to see what genetics have potential to move on, herbicide impact is one of those things they look at. Yeah. So knowing that some of these genetics are getting booted out because they can't tolerate the herbicide that's applied, you would think that some of those that do make it through, there's got to be variability in how they respond and what actually does make it through. And then what he talks about in terms of, okay, well, what about under higher stress situations? Those ones that made it through maybe didn't show impact in those few years because they weren't as stressed. And now you get in the field and there is stress. So there's potential that it's there, but we don't have everything's anecdotal in Western Canada for it right now. So I really think that's an interesting subject, and I'm envious of some of the research that OMAFRA does on some of that practical herbicide application information, and Mike does a great job.
Also, thanks for coming to my defense. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Of course. But I mean, in terms of PGRs, this is something that, when I started in this role, this is one of the biggest questions that started coming my way is, I'd love to have a variety specific management plan, but this is the same question, the same challenge when it comes to RVTs and having multiple management pieces in RVTs is who's going to pay for that. It just becomes very expensive to trial all these things. And there is one researcher who has done a very good job looking at the impacts of management on different varieties. Actually, I should say too, Dr. Sherry Stridehorse, who was with Alberta Ag and is now with the U of A, and then Laurel Thompson at Lakeland College. Both of those researchers are looking at how some of these varieties respond to PGR management, to nitrogen management. So there are resources out there, and it's growing, and that's because producers are asking these questions. And it's been very interesting information that's been coming from some of this research. I mean, you look at Sherry Stridehorse's research on PGRs, and she did both CPS and CWRS varieties. She did a whole plethora of them over a few different trials. And what I found was really interesting is some of the varieties that in RVT trials show that they have minimal lodging, they actually respond better to PGR application than some of those varieties that show they have lodging in RVTs. Now, that's not every situation, But that is under some situations, some of these varieties, even though they have poor lodging, they won't respond to a PGR. And again, this comes back to the concept of we need to be doing our own trials on farm to see how these things respond under our conditions. And then Laurel Thompson, who's been doing research on PGRs on malting barley, we're seeing varietal differences there with Modis. So this information is somewhat available, or it's going to be available soon, out of those two researchers. And even Sherry's done management differences of nitrogen of some CWRS varieties, and one of the big upcoming growing varieties in Western Canada is Viewfield, and we always want to compare it to Brandon because Brandon is that's carrying the bulk of the acres. One thing we've noticed is that Viewfield actually has a lower protein level at the end of the season. So Sherry did some trials comparing these two, and actually found out that on average, Viewfield requires about 36 pounds more nitrogen than Brandon to reach the same protein level. But the yield bump you get from those extra 36 pounds of nitrogen more than makes up for the cost of the additional nitrogen, and you're getting that protein. So this comes back to doing your own trials, but also thinking about G by E by M management, or G by E by M, which is genetics by environment by management. Each of these three things impacts each other. So you change your variety. Do you think the management plan that you have in place right now is ideal for that new variety? I bet you that there could be tweaks that could be made to your management plan to make the most of that variety. You take that variety and that management and you do move it to a different environment, you're going to have a different result entirely. So one thing I've been talking about over and over is we really need to be thinking about this G by E by M. As soon as you change one factor, you have to be asking yourself, is there something else that has changed in this equation at this point? Is there something else that I can do? And that's where reaching out to extension specialists, to researchers, and asking those questions, because if they don't have the answer, then it's a good question, and we certainly want to investigate it.
Well, and I think a lot of people, some of the farmers or agronomists watching are saying that makes sense. Like that Stridehurst data is very, very interesting. How the heck would I know? Like that's just on two varieties you're picking. There's a lot of other combinations that are out there, but it's very, very interesting. Actually, was also told that by the RealAg team that there's a wheat school that we did. Kara Oosterhouse filmed it on some of this research, so check it out at wheatschool.com. And of course, the wheat school sponsored by C&M Seeds, Syngenta Canada, and Alberta Wheat Commission, of which Jeremy gladly is a part of. So check it out, wheatschool.com. Let's get to some of the audience questions here. Kind of go back to near the beginning. Garrett had a question. Pete, is there certain variety characteristics that make an oat variety better for cover crop versus grain yield?
So I guess one of the real challenges with cover crop oats is that we get crown rust, particularly here in southwestern Ontario. When you talk about regional variation, we get up into the northern part of Ontario, and man, we don't need to spray oats for crown rust. We come down into southwestern Ontario, you have to spray twice for crown rust. And if you don't, you get what we call 20-20-20, right? 20 bushel per acre, 20 pound per bushel, and 20% of what you wanted. So it's just brutal. The challenge is from a cover crop standpoint, like I can manage, and some varieties have really high yield potential, but poor crown rust tolerance. So I'll grow those for grain yield, and I'll manage them to get my grain yield. Whereas for cover crop, I do not want to have to spray a fungicide on a cover crop just so that, because I want it to grow roots, right? I'm much less interested in the above ground biomass, and unless I'm taking it for forage, and there are people that do that, but I want it to grow roots. And so the one variety characteristic that I really would look at, and I look at it for grain yield too, but for cover crops, I look at that crown rust resistance, because I just don't want to have to add that extra management. Other than that, I don't think I don't think we have enough data actually to know for sure. And you talk about the variety specific data, you go to the UK, you buy that new genetic variety, they come with a full management package, like, do not spray this variety with growth regulator X because it's too hard on it. We've seen spring wheat varieties here in Ontario that got shortened by 50%. They went from about 4 feet tall or 5 feet tall to 2.5 feet tall when we applied the growth regulator. That does not increase yield. Trust me, you lose that much in height, it's all bad. So a whole bunch of these things, and Jeremy's made the point well, you really, like, you go slow, you figure out how it fits into your process, but all of these things matter. Our SMART trials, nitrogen by fungicide, synergy, man, our poorest variety that didn't synergize well at all, we got a 10 bushel per acre yield increase. It was barely economical. It was, but barely. Our best variety that's had way higher yield potential, 35 bushels per acre, 3.5 times more response to the same inputs. So exactly what you're talking about with Sherry's work, Jeremy, there is huge differences in how those varieties respond.
Jim Hale. Sorry, go ahead, Jeremy. Go ahead.
I just, coming back to that comment is how do you know all these things? How do you tackle this? And I think it can be, especially if you're starting to get into on-farm trials, it can be overwhelming. You want to answer all of the questions and understand everything. But I think it's a good idea to kind of scrap that mindset of ever knowing everything when it comes to these things. There's always new technologies and new varieties coming in. So think of it as, you start by asking simple questions. Is this nitrogen rate ideal? Should I be applying a PGR? Is this fungicide timing appropriate? And you can ask these simple questions and do these simple trials, and you will notice over the years, as you continue to ask these simple questions, you'll start asking yourself better questions, and you'll have answers that you've already created through those previous trials. So you can just kind of grow and snowball from there rather than trying to tackle everything at once, because there's so much information that we do know that we need to understand how it applies to farm. And then there's so much information that we don't know that you're not even going to be able to tackle it. So I just want to kind of reinforce the idea of starting slow, ask simple questions, and you'll get to the point where you're tackling the challenges that you want to tackle.
Yeah, and there's a lot of farmers watching this who are very agronomically focused, and then there are some agronomists that are watching that are advising those farmers. Boy, for some of those agronomists, there's some. I think some of the key takeaways here is if you can help your customers with some of this process through some of this data, boy, your value to that farmer's going up and up and up.
Oh yeah, so Sean, awesome! Like, you'd almost make me think you're an agronomist. Like but no, that's a really, if you're advising 50 clients, 10 clients, get them all to do the same trial, the same management inputs on a new variety and strips in the field, and you can compile that data. You become so much more valuable to the growers that you're advising. It's an awesome way to build the value that you're giving those growers for what they're paying you. It's really cool stuff.
Here's a question from Rosemary. I do not know the answer to this one. Is there a site to check out with annual forage yields on annual cereals and regional trials for use in silage, green feed, or swath grazing? In Manitoba, the last one was done in 2011. How do I compare one area to another?
I think this is a question for our new agronomist, Sean, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is for you, Sean?
This is for me. Here's what I would say. Rosemary, you should Google it.
Yeah, I would definitely, like, the Manitoba Crop Alliance, they're newly formed. All of those cropping commissions have come together to form one crop alliance. So I would reach out to them. They're going to have either the information or know exactly where to direct you for that information. And that is going to likely be your best resource, but I don't have an answer to that either. I don't know, Pete, do you got an answer to that?
I know that we did try doing some of that with oats here in Ontario. Oats is a forage crop after winter wheat, but nobody funds it. There's no funding for it, and you got to pay your technicians. You got to buy diesel fuel, and so it's very hard if you can't find someone that at least with varieties for grain yield. The people sponsoring the varieties, we've been able to get them to help support those trials. Man, forage trials, they're tough. So there's not many out there that I'm aware of, unfortunately, but a great thing to look at.
Yeah. Okay. I'm looking for it in the chat here, but I can't. Just give me a second here. It had to do with it was Lindsay's question. Sorry, I can't find it it was early in the show. Asking about breeding in some of these solutions to some of these diseases. You guys were talking about Fusarium head blight. How far are we away from where, sort of like we chase in canola with clubroot, genetics solves problems. How far are we away from maybe Fusarium head blight not being an issue because we've got resistant varieties?
Man, I'll jump in on that one to begin with because I'm the old dog here. And the first outbreak, the first real massive outbreak that brought it to the forefront in Ontario was 1981. And since then, it's been high up on the radar screen. 1996, we had an absolute disaster. And everybody in the industry has just focused in on that like crazy. Have we made headway? Absolutely. Have we gotten anywhere close to where we have true resistance to Fusarium? Not even close. And that's because it's such a complex disease with diseases like rust, where we can use a single gene, one gene, and we can get resistance. So their genetic solutions are can be fairly quickly available. But the problem with that is if you're using one gene, well, the disease can overcome that resistance very quickly. And so it can be good for 2 or 3 years, and then the disease beats it, and then you need another gene. With Fusarium, there's so many genes involved that, man, true resistance from a genetic standpoint, I'll be very surprised if I see it in the next 20 years. I hope I do, but it's a huge challenge.
Okay, I'm writing that down.
I'll top off on that. And I had a conversation with Dr. Anita Bruel-Babel, and she works at the University of Manitoba, and this is her focus, is disease management, Fusarium head blight. And I asked her this question, and I guess I'll phrase it this way: whether you're a first generation farmer or a third generation farmer, whether you're 20 or you're 60, you could probably say not in your lifetime. And Pete laid it out well. Is the amount of genes that are required for genetic resistance in this is enormous. And then, even if we are able to pull some of these in there, what you get is linkage drag. So you get some of these other genes that may be dragging down yield or increasing height or whatever it happens to be, increased tillering that causes more issues. So it's not just about finding those genes and bringing them in. It's about isolating those genes and not dragging in poor genetics with it, which becomes very much a challenge. So with the technology that we have right now, I would be looking more at how do I change or how do I adjust my management on farm to mitigate it as much as possible, to implement what I need to, knowing that this is going to be a long-term management approach. It's not there's no silver bullet around the corner.
Well, and hey, look at it. We've learned it with clubroot, where we have genetic resistance that we're trying to stay ahead of the disease. Look at what's going on with some of the breakdown in some of the corn borer trait. The reality is that you can have the solution in genetics, but you still can't get rid of some of the best management practices that you're responsible for on the farm. It's not one or the other. Those two things go in combo. Sorry, Pete, go ahead. You were going to say something.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I think that we're just the yield drag is a real issue when we get into these complex traits. We tend not to see it as much with simple traits. I don't know, maybe if we move into the CRISPR technology, we'll get better at engineering that, but it's just been a real challenge in terms of trying to get there.
That was the next question. Jeneth, who's watching on Twitter, asks, what are your hopes for CRISPR-T in regards to disease resistance? Have you followed the progress?
Yeah, and the answer is absolutely. And I'm really excited because there's things that we can do with it, but it still has to develop, and we still have to identify genes that work and genes that don't work and how to turn them on. And so it's not as simple as it seems. It's simple to knock out genes. With CRISPR technology, we can knock out genes, and if all we have to do is knock out a gene and that confers the resistance or changes the plant so that the disease can't impact, then that's reasonably simple. When it comes to inserting genes and making sure they work, they function, that they get turned on, you have the promoter gene in front of it and all those things, that's a lot more complex. And I'm excited for CRISPR technology because I think we just keep, it used to be that you just took the pollen and shook it over there and it was kind of like a shotgun, right? No,
it was called a gene gun.
That was actually the first transgenics. No, you go before even that, Sean. And well, actually, the real one is we dosed it with colchicine or some mutagenic compound and just prayed that we got something out the other end. Is bizarre. No, every time we make that move forward, we're getting more and more precise and better at finding the outcomes that we hope to find. But man, complex things like fusarium, it's just going to take a long time.
Jeremy, I got a question here from Michael watching on YouTube. Why are the majority of newer CWRS varieties rough-awned? As a cattle producer and grain operator, rough-awns can cause problems with cattle.
That is an excellent question that I certainly do not know the answer to. Why they have more rough-awns? I'm trying to think of why that would be beneficial from an agronomic standpoint, or whether that gene carries with it other beneficial genes that are kind of a secondary aspect. That, again, going back to that kind of linkage drag, we require this aspect, but it also brings this along. So I unfortunately don't have an answer for you on that one. I wish I did. Yeah, it is an excellent question. If you bug me after the show, I might be able to reach out to someone and ask that question.
Yeah, some of these questions coming in, Vince, but I need to do like a plant breeding one where I have a bunch of plant. That would be really cool. Pete, go ahead. Yeah,
no. So I think actually the answer is that the breeder is looking at grain yield. And so if as Jeremy says, for some other linkage, we get higher grain yield, how many breeders are looking at that variety that they're bringing in as a red spring and looking at that for forage? It's not the main focus of that variety. They're trying to sell it as a grain variety because that's the main focus. And they don't select for smooth-ons. We've had that here in Ontario. Believe it or not, some of the chicken farmers would like a smooth-oned winter wheat because the rough-ons tend to make the chickens scratch more or whatever. But it just isn't the major market, and so you don't pay the attention to it. And so Michael needs to talk to the breeders and just say, hey, there's a pretty significant forage market out here too. And maybe you need to select for some of those things as well that you haven't been selecting for. Interesting.
Okay, so characteristics that we're looking for. Let's kind of bring this back here before we wrap up for this evening. So I took some notes, learning here and having fun at the same time. So characteristics that I'm looking for if I'm choosing my cereal variety for 2021. And it's not, based on who gave me the best jacket or coffee mug. These are real characteristics of what's going on. Okay, so I have lodging, the fertility package I plan to go with, the quality, in terms of what's going to give me the best quality in my region, disease resistance based on diseases that I'm concerned about in my region, pest issues. So like, for example, like midge, if I'm really concerned about midge, I better be thinking about a midge resistant line. And also I added to that, as we're going based on Mike Cobra's video there, think about the herbicide I may have to use based on the weeds that I have in my field, but I got to collect some more data on, getting some information on that, maybe on some smaller plots. Does that kind of, I didn't write down? Maybe the one that everybody looks at first is yield. I didn't actually write down yield. That's sort of important.
A given, Sean. That's a given.
I got so honed in on the agronomy, I actually forgot about the one that everybody thinks about. What did we miss?
I think there's a couple that I want to mention, and there are more issues in Western Canada. So, one of the things, winter wheat survivability. Winter wheat survivability in Western Canada is a big challenge. So knowing and asking the question about winter wheat survivability, and there's a few new options. Like AC Wildfire is very good when it comes to winter survivability. So if you aren't able to put that into nice canola stubble for snow capture, that's a good potential variety that you can pick there. Icefield's been pretty strong, but it's a shorter season, but it doesn't have as good of winter survivability. So when it comes to winter wheat in Western Canada, check out some of those new varieties. Rob Graff has been doing a bang-up job putting out nice new varieties for Western Canada, so take a peek. And the other things that have come up recently are people looking at CPS versus CWRS, and understanding switching between that. And I realize that's not exactly variety selection, that's class selection. But some of these CPS varieties and the market difference, you're really looking for that 20% yield increase range when you're looking at a CPS versus a CWRS. A CWRS that's number one, 13.5 protein. So, making sure you understand that much of a gap is required to really make that leap and really hit that market where you want. And then the other thing that's come up and is becoming more and more of a challenge since we've lost Lillian as a CWRS, which is one of our only solid stem CWRS varieties, is wheat stem sawfly has continued to grow and be a concern. And a few of the producers I've chatted with, I've asked the question of, what's the potential of durum being produced in your region? If you can make that switch for a couple of years until wheat stem sawfly becomes, less of an issue, or the new variety comes out. But those are the other kind of big things that have popped my way that I thought were worth mentioning.
You just, with wheat stem sawfly, you just made me think of, I did a podcast series about beneficial insects that was with some great entomologists across Western Canada. It was a lot of fun, and one of them was with, I believe it was with Scott Mears. We talked about the Bracon cephi, which is the beneficial insect for wheat stem sawfly. It's like this little wasp, but if I remember right, it was orange, and it like tracks it down and it like stabs it through the stem. It was pretty cool. And Ray, I corrected myself, Ray commenting about how I missed yield, but I came back to it. But Jeremy added a really good one: use. I think that's actually that's important. It is a class selection thing, but a lot of times people think and hear about in terms of variety. Oh, I heard this variety is really good. Well, did you know that's actually a soft white? If you were going to grow it, what are you going to do with it? Things like that. So, Pete, what would you add to the list?
No, I think it's pretty well covered. I think Jenna put up there a minute ago sprouting resistance, and certainly that's important depending on your climate. But soft white, if you're growing a soft white, man, sprouting resistance becomes really quite important. So that's another one. And then I think Ray said, accepting a variety's shortcomings. I would argue, Ray, that it's not accepting the shortcomings. It's knowing the shortcomings and managing to overcome those shortcomings so that we maximize that yield potential. But I think it's a pretty good list, Sean. I don't nothing comes to mind after Jeremy added winter survival, which by the way matters in Ontario as well, Jeremy. Even though we maybe aren't quite as bad that
the
way.
banana belt down there.
Yeah,
mild
come on.
winter.
Hey, the most southerly part of Ontario is as far south as Northern California. So this is pretty nice, man. Pretty nice.
I've always, and Jeremy, you've lived in Ontario, so you know. But
I grew up in Ontario.
Yeah,
my boots and the boots. Everyone makes fun of me about. I mean, I can't live it down.
Minus 10 in Ontario is bloody cold. I don't, these Western Canadians that make fun of, when the Toronto airport shut down at minus 20. Yeah, that is bloody cold. There's no.
Sean, I tell you, I will take minus 30, minus 40 in Alberta any day over minus 15 in Ontario. Any day.
Absolutely. Hey, this has been a lot of fun, you guys. I really appreciate it. I'm going to have the two of you back for sure. And we're going to keep rolling through the winter here every Monday night in prime time. It is the Agronomists, and I hope you enjoyed tonight's episode on cereal variety selection. Pete, thanks a lot.
It's been awesome, Sean. Been awesome, Jeremy. Thanks so much for having me. Been a blast.
Hey, Jeremy, thanks a lot. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Pete. I look forward to the next time.
Now, sorry, I went to the wrong camera. Okay, for all of you CCAs out there, remember to go to realagriculture.com tomorrow, and you can choose you watch tonight's video and get your CCA credits. Pretty important stuff. I would say there's a real shortage of meetings out there for you to get your credits. Hope you enjoyed tonight's program. Really, really appreciate it. Want to point out that tomorrow on RealAg Live, that is our live stream in the middle of the afternoon, 3 o'clock Eastern, 1 o'clock Mountain, we got Machinery Pete on. We're talking used machinery values. There you go. We're covering all the bases. Machinery Pete, definitely a big celebrity in machinery circles, and I'm looking forward to having a chat with him. Thanks, everybody, for getting real and getting connected with the Agronomists, and we'll see you again next week. Cheers, everybody.